ABPG 1103 ABPG 1103 Introduction to Psychology in Introduction Edition. Do you know what is psychology? Psychology is not just about abnormal behavior and ways to influence people. Psychology can be defined as the scientific study of human and animal behavior. Behavior not only refers to the way in which people act, but also includes anything a person or animal thinks and feels. Why are so many people interested in psychology? Psychology is practical. It is a field of study that everybody can apply to their everyday lives. For instance, by studying how people learn, you might develop better study habits for yourself. By studying about human behavior, we might develop a better understanding of ourselves and others. You might also find ways of modifying undesirable behaviors such as overreacting or smoking. The goals of psychology include describe behavior, explain behavior, predict behavior, and change behavior. Describe behavior meaning by making careful scientific observations. Explain behavior by conducting experiments to determine their causes. Predict behavior when it will occur again in the future. And change behavior, it means transform inappropriate behavior. Areas of psychology include clinical and counseling psychology, educational psychology, social psychology, developmental psychology, cognitive psychology, industrial and organizational psychology, experimental psychology, and physiological psychology. Introduction to Psychology in Introduction Edition. The evolution of psychology. Since the time of Plato and Aristotle, people have wondered about human behavior. Hence, psychology's intellectual parents were actually 19th century philosophy and physiology, which shared an interest in the mysteries of the mind. Isn't it fascinating how psychology has developed from philosophical speculations about the mind into a modern science? Although Charles Darwin was not a psychologist, he was responsible for the idea that human behavior and thinking might be a subject for scientific inquiry. Before Darwin, people had considered themselves separate from all other creatures. Thus, they also considered themselves to be above the law of nature. Science was the study of the natural world. Hence, the study of humans belonged to philosophy. Darwin argued that if we are the product of evolution, maybe we too are subject to the laws of nature and thus can be studied scientifically. During the early 18th century, scientific research into biology, chemistry, physics, and physiology was already enthusiastically pursued. However, it was not until 1879 that Wilhelm Wundt founded the first psychology laboratory and psychology as a science officially began. As interest in this new field grew, psychologists started to develop different approaches to their research. Eventually, these different approaches came to be grouped into schools of psychology. The earliest schools of psychology was structuralism and functionalism. Structuralism is concerned with the sensations and feelings of perceptual experience. In contrast, functionalism goes beyond mere sensation and perception to explore how we learn to function in the environment around us. In the 1950s, psychology finally became recognized as a profession. The practical branch of psychology came to be known as applied psychology. It all started during World War I, when intelligence testing was in high demand for the assessment of military recruits. Alfred Binet developed one of the first useful intelligence tests. John B. Watson's view of psychology, known as behaviorism, was based on experiments conducted by Ivan Pavlov. Pavlov noticed that his dogs would start to salivate as soon as they heard the rattling of their bowls. So he decided to find out whether salivation could be shaped by learning. Pavlov found that all behavior is a learned response to some stimulus in the environment. He called this training classical conditioning. Watson confirmed through these experiments that humans as well as animals can learn new behavior through classical conditioning. Introduction to Psychology in Introduction Edition. Modern perspective of psychology. For many years, psychologists argued over the merits of the various approaches to psychology. The various schools of psychology battled against one another. Modern psychologists are less likely to support only one theoretical perspective and deny the others. Rather, psychologists today prefer to see the various perspectives as complementary. Each approach contributes in its way to our understanding of human behavior. Today, psychologists hardly talk about schools of psychology anymore. Most psychologists today talk about 6 basic perspectives that influence the topics psychologists study, how they conduct their research, and what information they consider important. The 6 basic perspectives are psychoanalytic, behavioristic, cognitive, humanistic, biological, and evolutionary. Psychology as science. The field of psychology is a powerful force in modern society, and its influence is widespread in advertising, marketing, law, and the way in which we view the world. So the big debate has always been, is psychology a science? Psychology, by definition, is the scientific study of human and animal behavior. The key words in this definition are scientific study. Although psychologists sometimes study abstract subject matters, such as the mind, they rely on a specific scientific method when conducting research. Psychologists, like all other scientists, methodically collect their data, then piece it together little by little until they reach a conclusion. Psychologists must follow systematic, scientific procedures when conducting research. These procedures are referred to as research methodology. All sciences share a common scientific method of research. They collect data through careful, systematic observation and attempt to predict what they have observed by developing theories. Thus, like all scientists, psychologists use the scientific method to describe, understand, predict, and eventually to achieve some measure of control over what they study. There are a few basic methods of psychological research, like naturalistic observation, case studies, surveys, correlational research, and experimental research. Introduction to Psychology in Introduction Edition. Ethics of Psychological Research. Almost all psychological research involves people and animals. Hence, it is important to discuss the ethics of psychological research, as psychologists have a responsibility to treat their research subjects ethically. There are numerous cases in which psychological research has exploited the rights of participants. For example, John Watson's Little Albert experiment. In this experiment, Watson used classical conditioning to develop a fear of furry little white rabbits in Little Albert, a 1-year-old baby boy. Imagine poor Albert having to grow up with a fear of furry little white rabbits. Another controversial experiment is Stanley Milgram's experiment. In his study, Milgram led the participants to believe that they were administering shocks to the learner for every mistake made. However, the learner's role was actually played by one of Milgram's accomplices pretending to be in pain. Deception is a commonly used strategy in psychological research. However, critics pointed out that Milgram's experiment was unethical because it led participants to believe something that was not true. Furthermore, critics also pointed out that Milgram should take responsibility for the guilt, inner conflict, and stress that participants went through in his experiment. experiment. The reason deception is used in psychological research is because revealing the true nature or objective of the experiment would cause participants to behave differently. This is also known as the observer effect. When the subject is aware of being observed, the subject might alter behaviors or act unnaturally. Hence, using deception in research is acceptable. However, researchers are expected to follow strict guidelines, which include debriefing participants at the end of the experiment. What about using animals in psychological research? Is it ethical? In the past, there has been research carried out in which electric shocks or some other type of unpleasant treatment was administered to animals. However, such type of experiments are rare. Almost 90% of the animals used are rats and mice. Furthermore, there are often guidelines set by the animal care committees to ensure the care and treatment of research animals. Finally, it is critical to remember, while counseling psychotherapy patients, that the contents of discussion be kept strictly confidential in order to respect the privacy of the client. The therapist also is not allowed to directly tell the patient what to do or to give a biased response.